Hey, what's up, guys? Just wanted to touch base with you here on Thursday. Hope it's going well. And now that we're a couple days into week two, touch base on what we are talking about this week and cover a couple of central concepts. So, let's get the groundwork started with just a brief discussion overview of the assignments due this week. Discussion one, you pick a story from the text and you discuss conflict and the nature of conflict. And that's really a central idea to the study of literature. As I put in my instructor guidance for the week, I told, the most boring story ever, and that's, hey, Jim was born to loving parents, raised well, married a great person, had kids and a decent life, and died peacefully in his sleep. It's awful. We all hate that story because A, it doesn't really mimic how life is for the rest of us, and B, nothing much happens because our own lives at various levels are filled with conflict, and not necessarily of a bad kind. Even buying a house, which I am currently in the process of doing, is a kind of a conflict, believe me. And it's starting to drive me a little insane. Nonetheless, the essence of a narrative is its conflict. That's a story, whether it's an anecdote that you tell a person, or an extended piece of literature such as those that we are exploring. And when you look at it through that perspective, you are sort of using a critical lens to examine things, and I'll get to what those are more in a second. But I want to say, though, that as I mentioned in my course guidance 2 for the week, that I look at texts through an existential critical lens, among other lenses. And to this effect, then, that means that I look at texts and I want to understand how they are tied to essential questions that we ask ourselves about being alive. And one of them is basically, what is going on? What is this thing called life? And then the second one is, who are these other people that we're thrown into life with? And then the third is, what is death? Because of all the species of which we are aware, we're the only ones who know in great advance of our own impending individual demise. Elephants and some other creatures and sick animals will know when they're in bad shape, and sometimes wander to a certain area, or prepare themselves for death. But that's usually when it's imminent, not when you're in the prime of life, yet you know that your own life is finite. And that, from an existential point of view, overshadows everything we do and guides how we make our life choices. And so when I read texts, I like to look at how these questions are being addressed. And you could say that those are all part of the essential human conflict that is just being alive. So I guess my point is that a conflict can be sort of internal, like that one, the very question of being alive, as well as external, when there are situations of external plot conflicts between characters, or even just like the book being set in a literal conflict. So some things about conflict: it can be explicit, or it can be just the very conflict of being alive, because just being alive and staying alive is sometimes hard enough, right? So conflict, you address that in discussion 1 for this week: conflict, and then picking out literary techniques and using the text to illustrate how those are displayed in whichever story that you're looking at. For discussion 2, you do the same thing, but you examine character and setting. So you pick a story, you look at a character from that story, you examine it in light of what you're learning about literary analysis, and then the same thing for setting. And then the assignment this week is an annotated bibliography for the final paper that you're working on. And the purpose of the annotated bibliography is to allow you to build up a set of resources that you can choose from to back you up in your final literary analytical paper, and to also display to me that you're doing that research work. And by going through the very process of writing about your sources, you will sort of help ingrain them and see the interconnection between them in your text even better. So it's a really great academic exercise, although it's not one that anybody is really ever really super stoked about. I'm not going to lie to you. I'm writing my own right now in my dissertation, and you only have to write a paragraph, I believe, for these, and mine has to be a page to a page and a half worth of annotation for each entry, plus a literature review essay. And so I feel your pain, and also it could be worse. So a little bit about that. Don't hesitate to reach out to me if I can help with any of these things. I've had some students calling, and that's been great. I sent out a message today about that. So call me. All right. Talked about conflict a little bit. Critical lenses. So I mentioned a minute ago that I was looking at text through an existential critical lens. And what does that mean? What do we mean when we talk about looking at literary text through different lenses? Well, one of the best analogies I can give is it's kind of like when you were a kid and you played pretend and you pretended to be different things or different characters, for example. And depending, oftentimes this involved probably like putting on costumes of some kind and adopting the role of something. So in this analogy, I'll say it's like wearing different hats. So, for example, in everyday life, I'm me. I'm Professor Matthew Leverins. I wear this hat, sure, but sometimes I change my hat. And I become Dr. Henry Livingston, American journalist and explorer, sent in the mid-19th century to find Dr. David Livingston. Wait, I'm sorry. I'm Dr. Stanley. I forget who I am at times. I have bad amnesia, and I journeyed into the wilds of Africa and the interior to find the missing Dr. David Livingston in 1866, and upon meeting him I famously and understatedly said, "Dr. Livingston, I presume." And now I'm Lou Gehrig, famous Yankees ball player in the 1930s, and up until the mid-90s, holder of the record for most consecutive games played. I was known as the Iron Horse, and although eventually I died of a disease that was named after me colloquially, I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth. And now, I am Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. In the mid-1950s, I took off my shoe and banged it on table of UN meeting and told American imperialist aggressors, "We will bury you." And now I'm back to me, right? So when you're a kid, you do that stuff supernaturally. Well, not supernaturally, but very naturally, I should say, right? And it comes and it's like no big deal. And you know you're not actually those people, but while you're playing that game of imagination, you're using your creative energy so well, you inhabit that role. And we sort of forget that we do that as we get older, and we take the roles that we play even more seriously. Although from an existential point of view, you would say that you're always playing at something. You're never actually the thing that you are. And those of you who wear a uniform for your job, be it fast food worker or member of the armed services, you know the connotations that go with that, with being in uniform versus out of uniform. So tying all this into literary lenses, this is where they come into play. Adopting a literary lens is like putting on one of those hats or putting on a uniform, but it's really a conceptual one. It's like a way of thinking about things, adopting someone else's perspective, and then reading a text from that perspective and trying to understand what factors might be involved in that. So, for example, some aspects of feminist literary criticism are concerned with the treatment of women in a text and the often the underprivileged and oppressed, and how are these like women's issues being a thing that strikes you in a text. So if you're reading one of these stories and women's issues come to mind, or the treatment of women in a text, without really even maybe realizing it, you're using a feminist literary lens. Or maybe you start to think about the author's life, and you begin to wonder, I wonder what happened to Hemingway in his life that made him produce this story, Hills Like White Elephants. If you're doing that, then you are using a biographical literary lens, which is also another one that I use myself a lot, in addition to the existential one. I used it in my master's thesis, as a matter of fact, on Charles Dickens. So when you're concerned with how the author's life might be influencing a text, you're using biographical criticism. And there's a whole school of thought that's totally opposed to that that says that the author's life has nothing to do with the text and the text exists by itself, and they're anti me in my position, and that's okay. I mean, I'm not anti them. They're all right, but I still believe in that. So my point is that all of these different sort of hats all sit together, and some match up well with others, some are opposed to others, but with each one, you're sort of using it to almost like a filter in Snapchat to pull a different sort of effect out of the text. I mean, that can be the different kinds of meaning that it holds for you. And it's one of the rich, amazing things that good literature has to give us. You know, as I've been reading some of the discussion posts from week one, and there have been various discussions of various themes at work, and it's been great to see a variety there, because it means that each of you is looking at a text and pulling out different kinds of meaning, and you're sort of all correct. I want to dispel the myth that there is a definite purpose and point to every story, because as I just noted, even if an author has a specific point that he or she is trying to make in a story, there's a whole school of literary criticism out there that says that doesn't matter. It doesn't even matter what the author says or thinks about his story. You know, the reader makes up the meaning out of the story. So it's a total free world of creative meaning. Now, sometimes you can stretch and like pull meaning that's really not there, and somebody will call you on it and be like, I don't think that Hills Like White Elephants is about the hard life of NASCAR race drivers. Right? Because, what? But other than that, you've got all the room in the world to play around with and try to pull different kinds of meaning out of the text. So feel free to do so, and keep that in mind as you're doing this literary analysis, because that's essentially what you're doing as you're writing your final paper. You are looking at the text through different kinds of lenses, pulling meaning out of it through what strikes you as meaningful from the text, and then reflecting on that. One note about the assignment, too. When it says primary and secondary sources, your primary source would be a source that talks directly about your text that you're examining, while secondary sources could be about other stuff related to your thesis or your general idea that you're pulling out of the text. So if I'm looking at Hills Like White Elephants and I'm trying to use a biographical lens, my thesis is that early experiences in Hemingway's life contributed to the overall sense of emptiness and loss in Hills Like White Elephants. Okay, there's a thesis. I could assert it. No, I don't know if that's actually true or not. I'm just making this up. But I could assert that in a paper, and then I would back it up with examples from the text and from that story, and a primary source would be the story itself, or anything else that Hemingway wrote like it, or similarly that you could pull in comparisons with, while secondary sources might be a source about abortion, or a source from a psychological point of view about loss or devastation, or gender studies about Hemingway's relationship with women, things of that nature. Secondary means not directly related to the text itself. Okay, and with that, just a final word. I've kept you longer than I ever have before about theses, and how do you make a thesis statement, and what is it? A thesis statement is sort of a roadmap for your reader about what your paper will be about and the order in which the information will come. And it also lets that person, your readers, know what you feel about it, like what your position is about the subject at hand, especially in in this kind of a literary analytical paper. So you're going to want to find a text and then find what speaks to you about it, and then with your thesis statement, you're going to say, going back to mine, Hemingway's powerful story, Hills Like White Elephant, there I'm letting the reader know that I think it's good and moving, resonates with readers so much because of the ability with which Hemingway injected his own life and relationships with women into its story of two people discussing an abortion at a bar in Africa. No, I'm sorry, I think it's Spain, right? I can't remember now offhand. With that thesis statement, I've said that I'm going to use a literary biographical lens on this paper, basically, because I'm talking about his life being injected into the work, and I've said that I like it. I could flesh that out a little bit and say with that thesis statement more, and I should really for a paper, about what within. I should say, like, with his use of character and with the dialogue and Jig's responses and with whatever else that's going to be a subtopic, Hemingway inserts himself into the piece and creates a masterful story. So, long story short, a thesis statement should be a guide for your reader about what's going to come next and the order in which that information is going to come, and should let them know your position too, just to reiterate. Okay, this is a ridiculously long lecture, and get a hold of me if you need anything, if you need any help. Don't be nervous to call. I always talk with a lot of students, and they frequently say at the beginning of the call, "Hey, I was kind of nervous about calling you," or like, "I almost didn't call," or I know I can feel jittery at calling a complete stranger and being like, "Hey, what's up?" But it's my job. I'm here to help. I'm your instructor, and if we were in a classroom, you probably, hopefully, would come up to me and speak with me. So don't hesitate to do so remotely now. All right. Have a great rest of the week, guys, and stay in touch.